The sound of music carried through the narrow hallways, echoing from the recreation room at the base of the apartment tower. Colored lights blinked across cheap paper streamers taped to the walls, and the floor vibrated faintly under the weight of stomping shoes. Families had gathered for a midnight celebration, neighbors crowded together, laughing with plates of food balanced on their laps. A child's laughter cut above the noise, followed by the clink of glasses raised in toasts that no one would remember clearly. It was the kind of night that turned a crumbling building into a home, however briefly. Upstairs, doors stood closed, yet thin walls carried the voices of joy. From one apartment came the muffled chords of a guitar. From another, the hiss of frying oil as someone reheated late snacks. Couples leaned against their door frames, whispering over the banisters, while old women shuffled in slippers down the hall to peek at the party below. The building breathed with its tenants, each floor alive, each corridor glowing with fragments of celebration. But in the dim service hallway, apart from the revelry, Harold Mercer stood alone. The uniform of a janitor clung to him, gray coveralls, faded from years of bleach and sweat. His face was expressionless, drained of warmth, his eyes fixed on the keyring in his hand. Metal glinted under the fluorescent light, a cluster of teeth and notches, each one cut for a different lock. He turned the ring slowly, letting the keys chime against each other, their sound almost musical, almost mocking. A young man passed him on the way to the bathroom, giving a careless nod. "Thanks for keeping the place running, Harold." The words slipped out casually, without pause, and were gone as quickly as the speaker disappeared around the corner. Harold's hand tightened on the ring. No answer left his mouth, only silence, heavy and deliberate. At 12:05 a.m., when the music downstairs swelled and the crowd cheered at the start of a song, Harold walked to the first door. Apartment 3B. His hand moved with steady familiarity, slotting the correct key into the lock. The door gave a soft click, so quiet it was drowned by the party below. Inside, a woman hummed to herself as she folded clothes. She didn't turn until the hinge creaked. Harold stepped through, shadow cutting across her living room. His voice was flat, stripped of emotion. "Every door opens, sooner or later." The woman froze, confusion rippling across her face. Then she screamed. The building's celebration fractured. Screams rose above the music, footsteps thundered down stairwells. Doors flew open, tenants stumbled into hallways thick with panic. What began as a festival of laughter collapsed into a chain of terror. The smell of smoke drifted from a kitchen where an overturned stove caught flame. Shattered glass glittered on linoleum floors. The hum of fluorescent bulbs broke into sharp buzzing as lights exploded one by one. On the fifth floor, a father pulled his daughter close, racing down the hall, only to find another door flung wide, Harold's silhouette filling the frame. Keys jingled like shackles in his grip. A turn, a push, and another household was swallowed by chaos. From the street below, passers-by heard the noise swell into something unrecognizable. What had been a hub of joy now sounded like a fortress under siege. Sirens began to wail in the distance, but inside the tower, the walls trapped every cry, every crash, every plea. The apartment building, once a vessel of warmth and community, became a labyrinth of fear. Its rooms, once safe havens, now cages. Its caretaker, once invisible, now the architect of their undoing. This is the story of Harold Mercer, the janitor who turned keys into weapons and silence into betrayal. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. By daylight, the building looked ordinary, a stack of brick and concrete that blended into the sprawl of the city's forgotten neighborhoods. Children played in the cracked courtyard, bouncing basketballs against faded asphalt, their shouts ricocheting off walls painted with graffiti that no one bothered to scrub away. Mothers leaned out of windows to call them in for lunch, their voices layering into a familiar chorus. Old men gathered on plastic chairs at the entrance, smoking cigarettes, swapping stories that repeated day after day. The apartments themselves were small but full of life. On the second floor, a couple raised their first child, rocking the crib gently while counting bills they never had enough of. On the fourth, a retired teacher fed pigeons on her balcony, scattering crumbs in the same rhythm she once distributed chalk. On the top floor, two brothers shared a room no wider than a hallway, headphones splitting their worlds apart even as their beds pressed side by side. Each tenant carried their burdens, their private hopes and disappointments, yet all of them shared the same walls, the same ceilings, the same fragile sense of community. And binding them together, unseen yet indispensable, was Harold Mercer. He was the janitor, the one who unclogged the drains that overflowed, who replaced the bulbs that flickered, who kept the boiler alive through the biting winters. His footsteps at dawn were as much a part of the building's rhythm as the garbage truck that rumbled by at 6 a.m. When pipes rattled, when locks jammed, when fuses blew, residents called for Harold and he answered without delay. But if they depended on him, they did not respect him. When he passed through the lobby, pushing his cart of tools and cleaning supplies, conversations rarely paused. Eyes slid over him the way they slid over the scuffed tiles he scrubbed. Children mimicked his limp when he climbed stairs, laughing behind his back. The key man, they called him, giggling as his overloaded keyring jangled at his side. He smiled faintly, as though the sound amused him too, but his gaze lingered on the children longer than necessary until they quieted. Still, no one considered Harold a threat. He was the man who carried every spare key, who entered apartments at the tenant's request to repair or retrieve, who knew the smell of every kitchen, the layout of every bedroom. When a couple lost their cat, Harold found it hiding beneath the stairs. When a storm cut the power, Harold lit candles in the hallways. He was present in their lives, stitched into the fabric of their security, yet always peripheral, like wallpaper they forgot to notice. On evenings when families gathered in the recreation room, Harold could be seen at the edge of the crowd, wiping tables, replacing trash bags. He moved in silence, never joining the laughter, never raising his glass. He was background, dependable, invisible. No one wondered what he thought as he turned away, keyring heavy at his hip. The building itself seemed alive with ritual. Mornings smelled of coffee and frying bacon. Afternoons carried the hum of vacuum cleaners. Nights swelled with televisions and music. The clatter of locks echoed constantly. Doors opening, doors closing, thresholds crossed in casual confidence. Behind each door was a private world. Yet Harold was the one person who bridged them all. Every lock he had tested, every cylinder oiled by his hands, every latch that yielded to the right twist of metal. It was a trust given without question, built into the routines of urban life. No one imagined the same keys could turn against them. No one imagined the janitor would step beyond repair and into judgment. The building lived because Harold kept it alive. And one night, the same man would decide it should no longer breathe. They were not strangers to Harold Mercer. Each face behind each door had been seen by him hundreds of times, their routines as familiar to him as the grooves in his keys. The building was his map, and its residents were markers on a chart he knew better than his own reflection. On the second floor lived Michael and Dana Brooks, a young couple who had moved in after their wedding. Their laughter spilled through the walls, the sound of beginnings. Dana often stopped Harold in the hall to ask about leaking pipes or squeaky hinges. She thanked him with a distracted smile, one hand always on her phone. Michael, less polite, sometimes shoved past Harold without acknowledgement, muttering about rent and repairs. Their door was painted blue, the only one in the corridor not left in its original beige. Harold had painted it for them himself, a favor they never remembered to repay. Above them, in apartment 4A, lived Mr. Lionel Graves, a retired veteran with a stiff spine and a silver cane. He wore his medals on Memorial Day, standing proudly in the lobby shaking hands with neighbors who admired his service. But when Harold passed, Lionel's gaze hardened, his jaw clenched. Once years ago, Harold had tried to strike up a conversation about the war, but Lionel cut him off with a sharp, "You wouldn't understand." That silence never lifted. Still, Lionel's locks turned smoothly, his doors never jammed because Harold kept them that way. On the fifth floor resided Clarissa Moore, a single mother of two. Her children darted through hallways, trailing laughter and chaos, their sneakers squealing against the tiles Harold polished. Clarissa often left her garbage bags piled outside the door long after collection hours. "You'll take care of it, won't you?" she said once, voice lilting with the assumption of service. Harold had nodded, lifting the leaking plastic with gloved hands. The stench of rot clung to his sleeves for the rest of the day. Others filled the building's layers. The elderly sisters in 2C who whispered gossip through their mail slot. The landlord's nephew in 6B who blasted music past midnight. The student in 7A who paid rent late every month but never forgot to tip Harold a crumpled dollar bill. They were a mosaic of lives pressed together by circumstance, bound by thin walls and shared ceilings. Each tenant carried their own small indignities, their own little triumphs, and Harold was the silent witness to all of it. He knew the smells that seeped under their doors, the tang of burnt onions, the sweetness of cinnamon, the sharpness of spilled liquor. He knew the sounds that defined them, the coughing fit of an old man at dawn, the restless pacing of an anxious neighbor, the muffled sobbing of a woman alone. He knew which doors stuck in winter, which latches caught on humid days, which locks could be coaxed open with a patient hand. His keyring was not just metal, it was a ledger of their lives. When the residents gathered together, they spoke freely in front of him, their trust so deep it shaded into indifference. They gossiped about each other, about debts, about affairs, never considering that Harold heard everything, absorbed everything. They confided their vulnerabilities to the walls, not realizing the man who cleaned those walls held access to their secrets. And in quiet moments, when Harold tested the keys in his palm, he could recall each face, each dismissal, each word that turned him into furniture instead of flesh. The blue door of Michael and Dana, the stiff salute of Lionel Graves, the garbage bags of Clarissa Moore. Each key belonged to a lock, each lock belonged to a life, and Harold Mercer belonged to none of them. Harold Mercer had not always been invisible. Years earlier, before the weight of keys pulled at his belt, he had been a husband and a father. Photographs once lined his modest apartment walls, his wife smiling under the glow of a kitchen lamp, his son clutching a toy fire truck. Those images were gone now, boxed and buried, but the impressions lingered like ghosts in dust. He had worked construction once, laboring under the sun, building the very kind of apartments he now maintained. Injuries accumulated, his back stiffened, and when the company replaced him with younger men, Harold was left without prospects. The janitor job came later, offered as a consolation, a way to stay employed in a city that swallowed men whole when they faltered. His wife left after 3 winters of this life. She said she was tired of the smell, bleach in his hair, rust in his clothes. She said she was tired of his silence, of how the job had drained him into shadows. His son grew distant, then vanished entirely, moving with her to another state. Harold did not follow. Instead, he remained in the building, exchanging family for floors and pipes, finding his rhythm in service rather than love. At first, he believed the work might restore dignity. The residents called him dependable and some thanked him politely. But gratitude waned quickly. They grew impatient with delays, mocked his slow limp, or ignored him altogether. Over time, the quiet nods he gave in hallways became reflexes, masks for the sting of dismissal. There were moments when the fracture showed. Once, a resident laughed at him openly, mimicking his walk, and Harold's fist tightened around his wrench until his knuckles whitened. Another time, children slipped spare change into his mop bucket as a joke, their giggles ringing as coins clinked. He emptied the bucket without a word, but that night the metallic sound replayed in his ears until dawn. Even so, Harold endured. He swept broken glass from stairwells, patched holes in drywall, cleared drains clogged with grease. His existence shrank into repetition, his worth measured by tasks nobody else wanted. And in that reduction, a darker seed grew. The keys at his side, once symbols of trust, became heavier each year, their clatter sharper. One winter, when the heating failed during a blizzard, Harold worked 3 nights without sleep to repair the boiler. He stood in the basement, wrapped in steam, his hands raw and blistered. By dawn, warmth returned to the building, and families rejoiced. Children ran through hallways again, their laughter bouncing off the walls, but nobody thanked Harold. They spoke instead of their relief, their parties, their comfort, as though the warmth had returned by miracle. He stood apart, listening, and felt a silence inside him that could not be patched. What began as service became resentment. What began as duty became humiliation. And beneath it all, Harold's identity eroded, leaving only the janitor, the man of keys. It was in this erosion that the fracture deepened. When his reflection in the mirror showed only tired eyes and the sagging fabric of his uniform, Harold began to see himself less as a man and more as the sum of doors he could open, the sum of secrets he could reach. The world had forgotten Harold Mercer, but Harold Mercer had not forgotten the world. The jangling ring of keys followed Harold Mercer everywhere. It hung heavy from his belt, clinking with each step as if mocking him, a chorus of metal voices whispering his place in the hierarchy of the building. To the residents, it was the sound of convenience, of access, of safety. To Harold it became something else, an echo of every slight, every dismissal, every moment he was reminded that he existed only in the margins. There was the day Michael Brooks tossed his keys at Harold after locking himself out, the metal striking Harold's chest before dropping to the floor. "Do your job," Michael muttered, impatient, already looking away. Harold bent to retrieve them, his fingers trembling not from the weight of the keys but from the humiliation of being treated like a servant rather than a man. There was the night Clarissa Moore left her trash rotting outside her door again. When Harold finally dragged the leaking bags to the chute, the stench clung to him all evening. Passing her later in the hall, she smiled faintly, saying, "Knew you'd handle it." The casualness of her words sank into him like a blade. Even the children carried their share of cruelty. They imitated his limp, their laughter sharp as glass. Key man," they sang, rattling coins in their pockets as if mocking the sound of his keyring. He smiled tightly, the expression rehearsed, while the echo of their chant followed him back to the basement. The symbolic weight of the keys grew unbearable. Each one represented an apartment where he was tolerated but never welcomed, where he entered only to fix what others had broken. Each notch cut into the metal felt like a tally of indignities, each door a reminder of his place, necessary but unwanted. The ring jingled when he walked, and in its music he heard not duty but ridicule. In the supply room, alone, Harold sometimes laid the keys on the table, arranging them in rows, the largest for the front entrance, the smallest for storage closets, dozens in between, each tied to a family that dismissed him, ignored him, or mocked him. He would touch each key lightly, tracing grooves with his fingertip, murmuring the apartment number under his breath. In those quiet rituals, resentment crystallized. One evening, after repairing a leaking pipe in 4A, Lionel Graves brushed past him without a word. The veteran's cane struck the tile with sharp, rhythmic taps. Harold stood in the hallway afterward, dripping water onto his boots, staring at the closed door. His hand touched the keyring at his hip, feeling the weight. The authority he carried yet was never acknowledged for. By then the keys were no longer tools. They were symbols, tokens of humiliation disguised as responsibility. Each metallic clink replayed memories he could not escape. Laughter in hallways, insults murmured under breath, the look of indifference on faces that never remembered his name. And as days turned into years, Harold began to imagine the keys differently. Not as instruments of entry, but as instruments of reckoning. The metal that had once chained him in servitude began to gleam with another possibility. He never spoke of this change. He never allowed expression to cross his features when the ring clattered against his leg. But inside, where silence carried sharper edges, Harold Mercer had already begun to redefine what those keys meant. The tools of Harold Mercer's trade were never meant to harm. A mop, a plunger, a wrench, bottles of bleach and ammonia, all common items resting innocently in the maintenance room. Yet in his hands their meanings shifted. What once cleaned became corrosive, what once repaired became destructive. He studied them in silence, considering their new roles, as if the building itself had provided the instruments of its undoing. The first experiment came with the cleaning agents. Harold poured bleach into a bucket, then added ammonia, watching the fumes curl upward, sharp and acrid. The mixture burned his eyes, seared his lungs, and he smiled faintly as he closed the lid. Left long enough, the fumes filled the small storage closet, clinging to walls and fabric. It was a reminder that danger hid in plain sight, masked as maintenance. Light bulbs became another lesson. He crushed them carefully, wrapping the shards in cloth before slipping them into bags of trash. The glass shimmered under the fluorescent light, jagged teeth waiting to slice. He imagined them scattered across stairwells, invisible until blood proved their presence. The idea lingered, not yet acted upon but rehearsed in his mind. Keys themselves turned under his file, metal scraping against metal as he sharpened edges. The sound was harsh, grating, but precise. He tested the altered shapes against the locks, smiling faintly when they still turned smoothly. The filed edges gleamed like blades under the dim bulb of his workshop. What had been symbols of humiliation now doubled as weapons, sharpened both literally and symbolically. Harold rehearsed his rituals with the patience of a craftsman. He tested door hinges at night, applying oil to some, leaving others to squeal. He counted steps between stairwells, measured the time it took for the security lights to flicker on. His work cart, once loaded with harmless supplies, grew darker in intent. He organized it not for repair but for infiltration, each item placed with quiet precision. He remained outwardly the same. Residents saw the familiar figure with his cart and his keys, his silence unchanged. They greeted him with distracted nods, their voices carrying indifference. But beneath the surface, Harold was rewriting the script. The mop handle leaned differently in his grip. The bucket sloshed with a more caustic promise. The keys chimed like a chorus of conspirators. Late one night, he tested his first silent entry, apartment 2C. The elderly sisters had long since gone to sleep. Harold slid the key in slowly, turning until the lock gave without resistance. He did not step inside. He only stood in the doorway, listening to the soft wheeze of their breathing. He remained there for 2 minutes, then withdrew, closing the door quietly behind him. The sisters never knew he had been there, but Harold knew, and that knowledge changed everything. From then on, the building became a rehearsal stage. Harold moved with greater confidence, testing locks, timing lights, memorizing patterns of sleep and absence. He began to see not apartments but cells in a larger organism, veins he could constrict, lungs he could suffocate, a heart he could stop. The janitor's closet, once cluttered and mundane, transformed into an arsenal. Bottles lined the shelves like chemicals in a laboratory. Keys hung from hooks in careful order. Tools gleamed under his lamp. Each night, Harold stood there, ring of keys heavy in his hand, listening to the faint echoes of celebration from above. And each night, the line between maintenance and massacre blurred further. One evening he whispered to the empty room, his voice flat, almost mechanical. "Every lock opens." It was not a statement of utility anymore. It was a sentence already passed. The weeks before the massacre unfolded with the calm of routine. Residents celebrated birthdays in the recreation room. Neighbors borrowed sugar and flour across hallways. Children chased each other down stairwells. The rhythms of the building never broke, but within those rhythms Harold Mercer heard a countdown. At night he walked the corridors, not as a servant but as a surveyor. His limp dragged slightly behind his stride, the keys at his side rattling with every step. To the unknowing, it was the sound of reassurance. To Harold, it was the ticking of a clock. He began with small rehearsals. One night he unlocked the laundry room, switched off the breaker, and counted how long it took before a tenant appeared with a flashlight. 3 minutes, 21 seconds. Another night, he scattered glass in a stairwell and watched from the shadows as a resident cursed when his shoe split open. On another evening, He timed the response to a smoke alarm he deliberately triggered with a candle and a towel. 8 minutes before anyone noticed the smell. Each test was logged in Harold's memory with meticulous precision. He marked which residents kept extinguishers, which doors had double locks, which windows opened wide enough to climb through. The building revealed itself not as a home, but as a machine, its vulnerabilities mapped in silence. The keys became part of his ritual. Before sleep, he laid them out on his table in order: front entrance, basement, storage rooms, apartments. He tapped each one gently, a roll call of doors and lives. Sometimes he filed an edge sharper, testing the bite against wood. Sometimes he polished them until they gleamed under the weak bulb of his lamp. The ritual was both preparation and meditation, an affirmation that the keys no longer served tenants but him. Symbolic objects gathered around him. A burnt-out light bulb, shattered into glittering fragments, placed in a jar. A child's marble he had picked up from the stairwell, its surface cracked. A rusted wrench bent out of shape. Each item was meaningless to others, but Harold arranged them carefully on a shelf, trophies of invisibility, reminders of the fractures that had accumulated over years. The plan tightened. The date fixed itself naturally, the building's annual midnight gathering. Music, drinks, dancing, children awake past their bedtime, the entire structure humming with distraction. It would be the moment of highest joy, the moment least prepared for terror. Harold circled it in his calendar with a pen, a simple red mark that bled through the thin paper. In the days leading up to it, he rehearsed the path he would take, starting on the third floor, then moving upward, floor by floor. Each door tested, each hinge prepared. He left some hinges dry, squeaking deliberately, a sound that would announce doom before sight. Others he oiled into silence, doors that would open like whispers. He plotted where smoke would rise first, where panic would push the crowd, where escape would be blocked. On the final evening before, Harold sat in the janitor's closet with the keyring in his hands. He closed his eyes and listened. The faint laughter of tenants drifted down the hall, muffled by walls. He could picture their faces clearly: the veteran with his medals, the couple with their painted blue door, the mother and her trash bags. All of them tucked into lives that had no room for him. He whispered one line, the same line he had tested before, but this time with finality. "Every door opens, and every lock belongs to me." The building above continued its rhythm: music, laughter, light. But beneath the rhythm, Harold Mercer's plan pulsed, precise and unyielding, waiting only for the clock to strike. The night arrived cloaked in celebration. Streamers hung across the recreation room, paper sagging from humidity. Colored bulbs blinked in uneven rhythm, casting red, green, and blue across the walls. Music thumped through the floors, rattling pipes and windows. Children raced between adults' legs, clutching paper cups of soda. Laughter echoed so loudly it masked the subtle shift in the air. At 11:50 p.m., Harold Mercer moved through the basement. His cart rolled in silence, its wheels freshly oiled. Inside, the tools no longer resembled maintenance but instruments of sabotage. Bottles sealed tight, light bulbs wrapped in cloth, keys filed sharp. He touched them each in turn before stepping away, the keyring heavy at his side. At 12 a.m., when cheers rose for the new song in the recreation room, Harold unlocked the door to apartment 3B. Michael and Dana Brooks were inside, half dancing, half arguing, their voices tangled in the music from below. The lock gave way with a quiet click. Harold entered without hesitation. Dana turned first, confusion flashing across her face, but the sight of the keys stilled her. Michael shouted, but the noise vanished under the shatter of a bulb. Glass sprayed across the carpet, slicing feet as they stumbled. Dana screamed, a sound swallowed by the music downstairs. Harold left them behind, closing the door as calmly as he had opened it. The hallway lights flickered. From 4A, Lionel Graves heard the disturbance, his cane tapping sharply as he stepped forward. "Who's there?" His voice carried authority, but when Harold appeared, Lionel faltered. Recognition spread across his lined face. Harold lifted the ring of keys and let it jangle once. A metallic laugh. Lionel raised his cane, but the sharp-edged key slashed across his hand, sending it clattering to the floor. The veteran's defiance ended in silence. On the fifth floor, Clarissa Moore's children pressed their faces to the window, pointing at fireworks blooming faintly over the city. Clarissa told them to sit, her voice half distracted. The door creaked. Harold entered with the calm of routine, the way he had entered before to fix her faucet or collect her trash. The difference lay in his eyes, flat and cold. Clarissa rose quickly, confusion turning to fear. "Harold, what are you doing?" The only answer was the metallic click of another key sliding free from the ring. Floor by floor, door by door, the massacre unfolded. The music downstairs masked the first screams, but soon the sounds of panic pierced through. Tenants fled into hallways where smoke began to curl, a fire already spreading from the kitchen of 3B where Harold had overturned the stove. The air thickened with the stench of burning grease. Feet pounded stairwells slick with shards of glass. Children shrieked, mothers pulled them close, fathers shouted for order that never came. Harold moved steadily, never rushing. His limp was deliberate, his path precise. He unlocked doors, let terror spill out, and closed them again. The keys sang in his grip, each chime marking another intrusion, another reversal of trust. Laughter evaporated into screams, music collapsed into chaos. By 12:20 a.m. the building was a storm. Sirens wailed in the distance, but inside, sound folded into layers of horror, glass breaking, alarms shrieking, voices crying for help. Smoke thickened, clawing at lungs, coating tongues with the taste of ash. Lights failed one by one, plunging corridors into darkness broken only by the glow of fire. And still Harold Mercer moved, unlocking, entering, closing, moving on. His expression never changed. The janitor, once ignored, once trusted, now wielded his silence like a weapon. The building he had kept alive was now his theater of ruin. The party had begun as a celebration. It ended as a reckoning. The first fire alarm shrieked at 12:24 a.m. Its piercing cry should have signaled safety, but instead it mingled with chaos, amplifying panic rather than guiding escape. Tenants rushed into hallways thick with smoke, coughing as their eyes stung. The building's once familiar corridors had become a battlefield of confusion. On the third floor, neighbors shoved past each other toward the stairwell, only to find it blocked by flames licking upward from the kitchen of 3B. The smoke there was black, greasy, suffocating. Those who attempted to push through stumbled back, their clothes smoldering, their lungs choked. Screams filled the stairwell, echoing through every landing. Children clung to their parents, some barefoot, stepping on glass that glittered invisibly on the tiles. Each shard cut into skin, leaving trails of blood across the floor. A boy fell and cried out. His hand sliced open as he tried to rise. His mother dragged him forward, her sobs drowned by the roar of the spreading fire. In 4A, Lionel Graves lay unconscious near his door, his cane still on the ground. A neighbor tried to lift him, shouting for help, but others pushed past, their faces twisted in desperation. Panic dissolved solidarity. The bonds of community that once defined the building shattered into fragments of survival. By 12:30 a.m., the smoke alarms on every floor screamed in unison. Water began to drip from sprinklers, but the system faltered, coughing weakly, failing to douse the flames. Instead, the hallways grew slick, puddles mixing with blood and shards. The smell of scorched wiring filled the air, acrid and metallic. Emergency lights flickered on, casting long shadows across corridors. In that red glow, tenants saw Harold Mercer. He stood at the end of a hallway, keys dangling from his hand, his coveralls darkened by soot. For a brief second, hope sparked. They thought he had come to save them, to lead them out as he always had. But when he stepped forward, unlocking yet another door with mechanical precision, hope collapsed into horror. "Help us!" a woman cried, her voice breaking. Harold did not look at her. He opened the door, disappeared inside, and screams followed. When he emerged, his keys jingled once more, steady, deliberate, unhurried. The crowd scattered, some rushing back into smoke, others pounding at windows too narrow to escape. By 12:40 a.m., the sirens outside grew louder. Red and blue lights reflected against the glass of the upper floors. Fire engines arrived, their ladders rising but flames already curled from windows, spewing sparks into the night. Firefighters shouted, aiming hoses upward, water arcing through the dark. The crowd outside gathered, pointing, screaming, powerless as they watched the building burn. Inside, tenants pounded at the front entrance, but the lock resisted. Panic swelled. Someone screamed that the doors were jammed. Few realized the truth, that Harold Mercer had already passed through minutes earlier, key turning smoothly, bolt sliding into place behind him. The exit that once represented safety had been sealed. Smoke pressed into every corner, turning the air thick and wet. Each breath scraped throats raw. The stench of burning plastic and fabric clung to skin, coated mouths with bitterness. In stairwells, bodies stumbled over each other, disoriented, blinded by tears. The heat grew unbearable, a furnace fed by oxygen from shattered windows. By 12:50 a.m., the building no longer resembled a home. Its walls groaned, ceilings cracked, and the party that had once united neighbors dissolved into scattered survivors clawing for life. The courtyard outside was filled with shouts, but inside the tower, voices were fewer now, weaker, swallowed by fire and smoke. Amid the chaos, Harold's limp echoed across the wet tiles, steady and patient. He moved not as rescuer but as executioner, his keys jingling with every step. The building had become what he had prepared it to be, not a sanctuary but a trap. At 1 a.m. the fire was at its peak. Flames curled from windows on the upper floors, sending plumes of smoke into the night sky. Firefighters battled fiercely, ladders scraping against walls, hoses spraying torrents of water, but inside the building the damage was already irreversible. The smell of burning wood, plastic and flesh clung to the air, seeping into every corner of the block. And yet Harold Mercer remained. When the first team forced their way through the basement entrance, flashlights cutting through haze, they found him seated calmly in the janitor's closet. His keyring lay across his lap, gleaming faintly in the beam of light. He did not rise when they shouted. He did not resist when they dragged him out. His body was coated in soot, his face streaked with ash, but his eyes were unblinking, almost serene. Outside, the courtyard was chaos. Survivors staggered under blankets, coughing into oxygen masks. Mothers sobbed into the shoulders of strangers. Children clung to stuffed animals soaked with water. The air rang with sirens and shouted orders, but all sound seemed to dim when Harold was led out in handcuffs. Heads turned. Fingers pointed. The whisper moved quickly. The janitor, the one who had keys to every door, had been the architect of their ruin. At the station, investigators pressed him for answers. They demanded to know why, demanded to know how long he had planned it. Harold gave little. He sat at the metal table, staring at the keyring now tagged as evidence. Only once did he speak at length, his voice low but steady, his words carrying the weight of ritual. "You trusted me because I was invisible. You gave me every door, every lock, every life. I kept them all working, year after year, and not one of you ever saw me. Keys are not just tools, they are power. They are promises. And every promise was broken, so I opened the doors. Every one of them, because they were never yours, they were mine." The officers in the room exchanged glances, unsettled by the calmness of his tone. He did not shout, did not tremble. His confession was not a burst of guilt but a statement, stripped of emotion, as though he were reading instructions. When asked about the victims, he merely looked at the keys and answered, "They opened." The manifesto they pieced together later came not from a written document, but from his rituals. In his closet, they found the shelf of symbolic objects, the shattered light bulb, the bent wrench, the child's marble. Each item cataloged like trophies, each carrying a private meaning that investigators could not fully decode. Together, they formed a mosaic of resentment, an unspoken diary carved in objects instead of words. News spread quickly. The story filled headlines. A janitor with access to every apartment, every life, had turned his trust into terror. Reporters stood outside the charred shell of the building, their voices echoing the disbelief of a city that had never considered such betrayal possible. Survivors spoke of Harold with voices that shook, How he had fixed their pipes, how he had smiled faintly in hallways, how he had always been there, silent, dependable. Dependable until he wasn't. At 3 a.m., Harold was transferred to a holding cell. He walked with the same limp, the same jingle of keys now absent from his side. Without them, his silhouette seemed smaller, yet the calmness never left his face. He sat on the metal bench, hands folded, eyes fixed forward. The confession was over. The silence that followed carried more weight than his words. The trial of Harold Mercer began 6 months later in a courthouse filled with survivors, reporters, and the families of the dead. Outside, television vans lined the street, their antennas piercing the sky. Protesters gathered behind barricades, holding signs that read "Trust betrayed" and "Justice for the victims." Inside the courtroom, the air was tense, thick with expectation, every cough or shuffle echoing against marble walls. Harold entered wearing the plain orange of a prison jumpsuit. His limp remained, but the keys that once marked his presence were gone. Instead, his wrists bore steel cuffs. The absence of the keyring seemed to unsettle the spectators more than the chains did. Without it, Harold appeared diminished, yet when he raised his head and met the room's gaze, silence fell. The prosecution opened with stark detail. Photographs of the burned apartments were displayed. Blackened hallways, melted fixtures, scorched cribs. Survivors gave testimony, voices trembling as they described smoke, screams, and the sight of Harold unlocking doors with calm precision. A young boy, his arm still bandaged, whispered that the key man came into our house and didn't leave. His words cracked the room open into sobs. The defense offered little. They argued Harold's mind had fractured under years of isolation and humiliation. They spoke of his wife leaving, his son abandoning him, his life shrinking into the walls of a building that never valued him. They tried to paint him as a broken man, not a monster, but the evidence outweighed sympathy. Keys sharpened into blades, chemicals mixed into toxins, rituals rehearsed in secret, all pointed not to madness but to deliberate design. Throughout, Harold sat expressionless. His eyes lingered on the photographs, on the witnesses, but his face never changed. Only once did he speak, when asked if he regretted his actions. His reply was steady, almost whispered, but the microphones carried it across the silent room. "I kept the doors for them, they never kept one for me." The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the foreman's voice did not tremble. Guilty on all counts: murder, arson, aggravated assault. The judge, stern and weary, delivered the sentence: life without parole. The gavel struck, the sound sharp, final, echoing like the click of a lock. Some survivors wept. Others nodded grimly, their grief sharpened into the thin blade of justice. The families of the dead held hands, their faces hollow but resolute. Yet even in that moment of closure, unease remained. Harold had not raged, had not begged, had not wept. He had only sat in silence, his expression unchanged, as if the trial were not judgment but ritual. When the guards led him away, shackles clinking, Harold turned his head slightly, scanning the room as though counting doors. His gaze lingered on the families, then drifted upward toward the courtroom's high windows. Sunlight filtered through, striking the polished floor. For an instant, the sound of chains seemed to echo like keys, and then he was gone, swallowed into corridors that locked behind him one by one. In the months that followed, the building stood in silence, its walls blackened and windows boarded. The once bustling courtyard was empty, grass withered beneath the weight of ash. Tenants who survived had scattered across the city, unwilling to return to a place where laughter had turned to screams. Children who once played in the stairwells now crossed the street when passing by, their eyes wide, their pace quickening. Inside the police evidence locker, Harold Mercer's keyring lay sealed in a plastic bag. Each key tagged and numbered, each notch catalogued. Investigators had debated keeping it for further study, but in the end it remained untouched, locked away with other remnants of the night. The sound of its jangle no longer echoed through hallways, but in memory it lingered. Survivors swore they could still hear it in their dreams, the metallic rhythm chasing them through corridors of smoke and fire. Reporters revisited the story in documentaries and late-night specials. They called it the Night of Keys, a phrase that captured both the method and the betrayal. The narrative painted Harold as the invisible man who had become executioner, the trusted janitor who turned guardianship into judgment. Yet even through interviews and reconstructions, no one could fully answer the questions that hung heavy. Why then, why there, and why in such silence? The victims' names were etched into a memorial plaque near the site, their faces framed in photographs surrounded by candles. Families gathered on anniversaries, placing flowers beneath the charred facade. The plaque bore a simple inscription, "Trust broken, lives taken." It was both epitaph and warning. And still, Harold Mercer lived on. Locked away in a state prison, he passed his days in the same silence he had carried in the building. Guards reported he rarely spoke, rarely moved beyond the confines of his routine. Some said he would reach for his belt unconsciously, fingers brushing air where the keys had once hung. Others claimed he whispered numbers in the dark, apartment by apartment, as though rehearsing a map etched forever in his mind. The legacy of his actions spread beyond the building. Landlords tightened their policies. Residents grew wary of the unseen figures who held master keys. Trust, once casual, became cautious. Locks were replaced, cameras installed, systems changed. Yet suspicion lingered in every exchange, a shadow of Harold's betrayal echoing far past the charred brick of his tower. Years later, when a box of evidence was transferred to long-term storage, a clerk paused at the sight of the keyring. Dozens of teeth, dulled by time but still sharp under the light. He sealed the box, sliding it onto a shelf among countless others, unaware that the sound of the keys had once been the heartbeat of an entire community. What remained was not Harold's face, not his silence, but the sound, the cold jingle of metal on metal, once the music of maintenance, now the tolling of judgment. The building was never rebuilt. It stood as a ruin until demolition crews finally leveled it, scattering dust into the wind. But for those who survived, its corridors would never truly collapse. They carried them still, in nightmares, in memory, in the echo of a man who turned service into revenge. And so the story ended where it began, with a key sliding into a lock, a door opening, and the certainty that what waits on the other side may not always be welcome.